Hey everybody, welcome to the GMI Rocket show. 2 weeks off we had, so I'm really excited to be back here. Today is episode number 59, which is every time I do this, I'm like, I can't believe we're already here at 59. It's really exciting for me. I'm your host, Roman Zelichenko. I'm a former immigration attorney turned entrepreneur. I'm the co-founder of Laborless, which is an immigration tech startup that automates H-1B visa compliance, and also the founder of GMI Rocket, which is a digital marketing agency for the industry, and also which brings you this show. So our guest today is coming to us from Dublin, Ireland. So it is 4 p.m. Eastern here in New York, and it is much later in the evening in Ireland. So I'm really grateful. Our guest is Liam Brennan, who is the CEO of Tracker Software. So Tracker Software is a sort of high-level technology platform that is looking to integrate the different verticals that are part of the sort of business travel space. So it's tax compliance, immigration, et cetera. It's really an interesting concept, especially for me coming from the immigration side, because, and I've said this many times before, a lot of immigration lawyers in general kind of have blinders on, or at least I did. And, I thought about the visa process and I felt that once the visa is approved, everything's done. But of course, there's so much there to be so much remaining. There's the global mobility side, the relocation side, the tax implications. And so while there is great technology in the different verticals, Tracker Software is bringing something that looks to kind of integrate a lot of these things. So we're going to just get into this discussion and so much more. So Liam, thank you so much for being here, and good evening to you. Thanks for staying up and hanging out.
Good evening, Roman. Very nice to be here. Thank you very much. It's only 8 p.m. It's not too bad here now.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. I forget. I've had some guests that are, I guess, further east, and it's like 10 or 11 o'clock, and so I appreciate it.
The summertime changeover is this is the week where we get the extra hour with you guys. We went last weekend. I think you guys go this weekend.
That's right.
So it would normally be 5 hours to the East Coast. We're only 4 this week.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, so if this was next week, it would be 9 p.m. That's so funny. Every year, I feel like there's, social media crops up this, movement to get rid of daylight savings, and I would be okay with it, but I get that people don't want to wake up and have it be dark until 9 o'clock in the morning. So before we jump in, for folks who are watching and tuning in live, let us know, say hi, tell us know who you are, where you're watching from. This is an international episode today, so please drop a comment, tell us, again, who you are, where you are, what you do, etc. Of course, along the way, leave us comments and questions. If you have any thoughts or questions for Liam, please drop them. I'll always bring them up and we'll discuss it. And then, of course, give us a like or a heart or a clap or however you feel, depending on where you are. So Liam, I know that I hope I gave a decent description of what Tracker Software does. And of course, the idea of, and we'll get into it, right? And the idea of this like sort of layer on top of the different verticals within mobility. And you spent a number of years within the relocation space, and before that in the kind of moving industry, which, is really, it's a crucial part of folks moving from one country to another. I want to go before that, right? And I always love to kind of learn a little bit more about the guests and sort of who they are. So I know you're currently living in Dublin. Is that where you were born or raised? Like, is that where you're from?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I live at the moment in Malahide in Dublin. It's about 8 or 9 miles north of Dublin City, and so I live by the sea. So I walk out my door, and 5 minutes later, I'm on the coast, and it's a really nice place to live. I was born maybe 10 miles south of where I am, or closer to the airport. So I've lived here all my life, other than after college, a period in London and a short stint in Boston. But I lived in London for 6 years, but we wouldn't have called that an expatriate. Ireland and the UK would be seen as sort of migrant areas. So it sort of changes the way you describe. I went to London, lived there for 6 years, but would have never seen myself as an expat. So it's slightly different in terms of that context. So apart from that, I've been back in Ireland since '95, and time is flying. The hair is getting a lot grayer as than it used to be.
I feel that. I feel the same way too. I mean, I have fewer grays, but they're coming in. They're coming in strong.
Yeah.
So you went to, you said you moved to the UK or to London after college. Before, but you grew up in the Dublin area, so you went to, I guess, elementary school, middle school, high
Yeah.
school. I'm always curious, especially talking to so many entrepreneurs. When you were a younger kid, were you entrepreneurial? Did you sell baseball cards or something like that?
Not really. I was more, I suppose, more sporty. I was never the star quarterback, but I would have been on the school team. So I was more of a sports player. Never the superstar sports player, but I was always on the main team. I think back in I left school in '83 in Ireland, and that was a pretty bad time economically in Ireland. So the word entrepreneur was just unheard of. It was a case of you either went on to college or you got a job, and it wasn't the case of, oh, I want to become an entrepreneur. That came a lot later on in terms of setting up Tracker. And at the time, the sort of ratio of Irish people who went straight into college, because there was no real economic benefit, was quite high. And that what led a little bit to the sort of Irish resurgence years and years later, because the Irish economy, or the Irish people, became very highly educated. So a greater ratio of Irish people coming out in the 80s would have gone to college than in previous years. And it wasn't a case really of let's go and educate. It was a case of, well, there's nowhere else to go. It was either go to London or you went into college. And I went into college and then went to London. And that really was the sort of scenario in the 80s in Ireland. I think I went to London in '89. And started work there. And I suppose, I mean, I would always characterize I did psychology in college, but I didn't want to go towards the clinical side of the house. I always wanted to go towards the business, the management side of psychology. So those modules would have been more interesting to me. So I started in business in the UK, starting in sales, worked in general management in courier companies, fleet companies, freight companies. And it was a great time to be in your mid-20s in London. So London was flying, and you're earning a lot of money, and you're young, and again, not enough time to think about being entrepreneurial because you're having such a good time.
Yeah, that's interesting. I psychology is one of those degrees that, honestly, at least from a business standpoint, is applicable to almost any part of, if you were in marketing, then it's the psychology of how do people perceive the things you're putting out. If you're in sales, then what's the sort of the psychology behind your interaction with other people you're on the phone with. So it's really cool. I guess you said you wanted to get into the business side of psychology, meaning you wanted to work in like a clinic, but running a clinic, or
No. More so using my psychology degree in business or in management, in economics. So it was about using that sort of behavioral elements of psychology rather than the clinical elements. So I didn't want to go and run experiments in laboratories. I would rather utilize that type of motivation, behavioral science type of element of psychology. And I agree. I would say if anyone is unsure at age 18 or 19 where they want to go in college, a psychology degree is a very good grounding, because you can go so many places after that in terms of whether you want to go to clinical side, whether you want to go. And I would always describe myself primarily as a salesperson. That's what I think. If someone asks me, what are you? I will always say I'm a salesperson. So I would have used that more so in how I converted into becoming a sales manager, then into a general manager, and then from there moving into when I came back to Ireland, becoming a domestic manager of a domestic entity, and then moving into an EMEA managed role, and then setting up my own environment as well. So I think it was a stepping stone along the way, and I threw an MBA in there later on as well to sort of complement that. So I think the combination of that undergraduate degree and then the MBA is where you can equip yourself to be that broad. You could be a little dangerous on every subject. You may not know everything to a high specialism, but you know enough to be able to deal with every single specialism that comes up in a day-to-day business activity.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's such great advice. I think a lot of people who want to go into business end up getting a business degree, which is, of course, great. You might know a little bit more about accounting or finance, but then you get into the real world, and a lot of folks are, I feel, more crippled by human interactions at work versus by not knowing a subject matter. If you don't know something, you can always learn it, but sometimes the human interactions are much harder to navigate, actually. So I think that's really wonderful. So if anyone's listening who's 18 or about that age, really great advice. So you moved to London. You had your psychology degree. You're working in the freight and moving industry. I know eventually, of course, you will end up in relocation, and then now with Tracker, kind of touching all of these facets. But did you think about, when you were working in freight, did relocation or mobility, global mobility, come up, or was it sort of local moves, or how was that?
No, it was mainly working with the global multinationals on their export environment. So we're moving boxes rather than people at that point. And there's a phrase, I mean, boxes don't complain. So they were slightly different to moving people, and it was really more about getting the box to the right place at the right time and making sure that the supply chains were kept moving. And again, this was the time when a software package came in a box this size and was put on a pallet, or 300 of them were put on a pallet and shipped into the Netherlands and then distributed around Europe at that point in time. So it was a lot of physical property moving. And then as time moves on, obviously those items got smaller and technology improved it. So there was less reliance on the physical moving side of that. And that's when I switched across to telecoms at that point. So I joined BT, or British Telecom, and they were here in Ireland. And then I worked in their internet services division. And this was my first sort of entry into building products and building internet products. So this was 1999, 2000, which was just slightly before the dot-com boom, the dot-com crash. So we had this internet, we had this fantastic vision of what was going to happen with this internet, but really it was AOL and email and Gophers at the time. That was as much as it was. So by going into BT and starting to work in their internet services division, or their e-business division, I mean, even e-business was a new word in 2000. And that helped me, I think, understand how companies were able to look at the internet and then determine how could they utilize the internet for carrying out their business. Remember, everything else was offline. Now, most electronic business was about getting a leased line into your premises. An ISDN line was deemed to be sexy at that point in time. So to have a direct phone line from a supplier to a global multinational was the height of technology. There was no idea that this was going to be the internet. So this was quite hard for companies to understand, well, where do we go from here? And nobody really knew. And that sort of led to the dot-com explosion, because ideas came out, and then people followed the ideas, and then money followed the ideas. And then people realized, oh, hang on, this is going to take a little bit longer than we thought to come to fruition. And that was probably the best lesson I learned, was that things always take a little bit longer than you think. And certainly when we set up Tracker, it has taken longer to get where we want to be. But I don't see that as an issue. It's just history repeating itself. And that's the way it is. Everything takes a little bit longer to get where we need to be. So that started with dealing with small Irish traders who are starting to come into online shop environment. So we helped build the very first indigenous companies who were using the internet to market. We set up the first marketplace. I think it was marketplace.ie was the first portal that we created. And this was about creating a business-to-business portal where companies would trade in relation to e-commerce. So at this time, there were companies like Commerce One, which was soaring in terms of value. Ariba, which is still around today in a slightly different environment. And the idea there was that all companies were now going to go into auctions and bid all of their stationery and all of their pens, and suppliers would now have to come to the internet and auction it. And that concept did actually come through in the long run. It's less of an issue now, but in those commodity items, it finally came to fruition, but it took another 10 years. And Commerce One and those companies fell along the way. And Ariba had a number of different iterations, and SAP finally picked up Ariba. Wow. And they are still, I think, one of the major leaders for that online procurement. And anyone out there listening who's done an RFP for a major global multinational will have the pleasure of working with those portals and dealing with the upload of the information and the RFPs and the documentation and the pricing matrices all into those e-procurement environments. So that's really where that focus, and that's where I think I first saw the combination of sales and product coming together. So now I was still selling the product, but I was actually also building the product as well. And that's, I think, is where we ended up with Tracker, was that I wasn't looking at just selling the next product or selling the next. I was thinking, well, what are we going to build for the next iteration of something? And when we looked at what we were doing in BT at that time, there was some pretty good stuff going on, and it was groundbreaking, but it was very small in terms of the overall pace that global multinationals were able to move at that time.
That's such a great, I almost want to say lucky, but I mean, I don't know if you believe in luck or not, but so cool that you had this opportunity to work at a company that basically gave you the education around what it means to do e-commerce, at a time when it really wasn't as ubiquitous as it is now. I'm wondering, was it a tough transition for you? Because if you're going from, let's say, a non-technical role to now being in a product role, I mean, okay, it doesn't sound like you were coding the product, but I'm sure you were interacting with the software people. And
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
that, how did you go about that transition? Was it fairly easy? I mean, did the company give you training? And I'm specifically asking this question because, I came to start my company. I was interested in technology. I learned a little bit of HTML when I was a kid, so I knew something, but I was a lawyer by training. I didn't have tech experience per se. And so before I launched my company, I went to work at a tech company to sort of learn the ropes on someone else's dime, if you will. So I'm curious, how was that transition for you? And do you think if you hadn't worked there, you wouldn't sort of have had an inclination towards, technology the way that you do?
Yeah, no, I think it most definitely was the foundation for that. But I think it wasn't so much that I needed to understand the technical pieces of it. I mean, when you get in your car, you don't ask how it works. It works. So these things should work. But what's the purpose of getting in the car? What are you trying to achieve? And I think that's where I was able to link the previous experience and the skill set that I felt I had was, let's look at the business process here and how can we help the companies move those processes into an internet environment. And then the technical team would then work off that. So that's where I felt that my strength lay, was being able to understand, well, how do global multinationals work? How do the people in those multinationals work? Where's the blocker? Where's the real power in an organization? Where's the process currently? Where does it need to be? And then being realistic about what you can achieve, because it's very simple to walk in and tell a multinational that you're going to completely change the framework of everything that they do, but they still have to keep selling the stuff every single day or providing that service every single day. So you really needed to understand how you could bring that environment around. And remember, again, this was very new. People were stuck in a very traditional way of marketing. And even, through COVID of last year, you still had a lot of companies saying, well, how do we get online? And that's in 2021. So 20 years ago, that type of culture shock about moving their business online was different, and it moved at a slower pace. But for me, it was the start of what I would say is that I think one of my biggest skills is to be able to look at a process. And today, when we go to talk to a company about their business travel problems, we're looking at it holistically. We're not coming in a single vertical, and we're not saying, okay, you've got a problem in immigration, we'll fix that. You've got a problem in tax, we'll fix that. It's across multiple areas of the company. And that's where I think, if we go back all the way back to that early experience to what's happening in the business today in this horizontal versus vertical approach, that unless it works for the whole company and all the multiple stakeholders that are touched by an action, it's probably not going to fly. You might spend a lot of time on a project, but it may never get to be the type of project that you thought it was going to be, because you're not bringing the whole company along. You may be only bringing one stakeholder along.
Yeah, and there's like some change management lessons in there too, right? Because
yeah.
Well, if you're implementing especially a large scale software, a lot of people have to be ready for a new process.
Yeah, and remember, you had everyone, all of the skeptics in the company would have been energized by the .com crash, because there was a case of, well, we told you this wasn't going to work, right. And then that led to a slower pace of development after that environment. So that was the sort of the rapid rise, the rapid fall, and then there was a hiatus period. And this is all adding time to the cycle. But the internet wasn't going away. So then after spending 5-6 years with BT, I moved across to what's known as Travelport now, as the country manager for Ireland. And Travelport is Galileo, Sabre, Amadeus, what's called the Global Distribution Systems, or they're referred to as the GDS, that sits behind most travel agency systems. So in those days, you walked into a travel agency, somebody tapped away on the screen. It was a blue screen, IBM mainframe, connecting directly into what's called the GDS, Global Distribution System. And you also had an upstart airline here in Ireland called Ryanair, who was paying a lot of money to these GDSs to distribute their product. And then they realized, well, the internet will do this for me. And the distribution costs were disappeared overnight by Ryanair deciding, well, we'll distribute only via the internet. And that created a revolution then. And Southwest was doing the same thing in the US at that time. Ryanair actually came over, copied the Southwest model, and then came back to Europe and then implemented it, but far more aggressively here in Europe.
Wow.
So that was the sort of real catalyst for change. And now you had a traditional industry like Travelport that was challenged by the internet. So this was the first real challenge, was that in air travel was really where the processes in a company, the legacy processes, were challenged by the internet. And this was all happening on my watch in Dublin, and it was an interesting time to be trying to defend the legacy piece, when in reality, I'm seeing, well, this is going to change things. And we were trying to defend that position or that market share that the GDSs had. And there were big companies who couldn't move as quickly as a new upstart like Ryanair came. So that was, I think, the first real sort of glimpse to the power of the internet and the power of e-business, and how you could shake up and completely change an industry.
So how did you go from Travelport to the relocation company? It's now escaping my head where you work.
Yeah, I work with Paragon, and Paragon we're looking for an EMEA head, and I got a call one day to come and talk to them, and I liked what I heard at that point in time, and for me it was a move from being a domestic managing director into an EMEA managing director. So it was a good career move for me at that point in time. And I moved across to Paragon, and we set up the European division. Initially, I was dealing with franchising, but we had responsibility for all sales. And Paragon only had domestic US customers at that time. So we brought on the first European customers, and that was a culture shock for the American side of the house, because there's a different way of relocating and different approach to relocation in Europe compared to the US. So what I was doing there was translating this European model for our American colleagues and trying to understand that it's not quite the same, and you can't apply an American method of relocation into a European context completely. A lot of things you can, but you do need to understand the different cultural approaches to working with a French, a British, a German company. And you can't pick up the US model and just simply apply it in those areas. So that's where that again, down to business processes, change, understanding what companies want and what was going on in those companies, and then being able to translate it to an American management company.
Interesting. Yeah, I wouldn't think about that, but I guess if you're working on the global side of things, you start seeing the differences across borders, right?
Yeah, and a lot of it was revenue driven as well, because there's no real concept of home sale. There was part of it in the UK, but that was dying out, and it was really only with the legacy companies and the state companies. So there wasn't a revenue turn from marketing the home. The home sale revenues which are one of the largest earning parts for an RMC at the time in the US. That wasn't available. So you had to make your revenue from management fees, you had to make it from referral fees, because you couldn't back off those or not deal with those. And a lot of the US companies, that wasn't even a very significant revenue stream, because the home sale and the household goods moving was driving most of the revenues at that point in time. So you had different components of the revenues, so that again had to be priced differently, because you couldn't just simply pick up a pricing model from the US and apply it into the EU at that time.
That's fascinating, and it sounds like you, because you were in the freight business, but then to your point, you were moving boxes, not people,
Yeah.
and then from the relocation standpoint, you were working in travel, which is, even though there was business, it sounds like it was a business in sort of maybe high end travel type of organization, but you weren't seeing the immigration side, you weren't seeing the
No,
relocation
no.
side.
The travel time was more enabling
Yeah.
the sale and the distribution of the product. So again, we come back to distribution, we come back to channels, we come back to how do you get your product to market. And again, that experience led on to our distribution model that we have apply at Tracker. We don't market directly to corporates. We market through our white label partners. So we enable those companies to actually go out to market. So if you want to go and look at a business traveler product from Ayers, from BGRS, from Weichert, from Altair, they're all sitting on our platform. So we market through those organizations, BDO, Baker Tilly, all of those different companies are sitting on our platform. So you can see where the sort of building blocks of that experience was coming together to say, okay, how can we build something? How can we get a distribution channel? And this was, business 101. You have to have a product. You have to have a decent price that you can charge, but then you've got to have positioning and channels to be able to get that product to market in a cost-effective manner. And that's, I think, where we ended up with those sort of 3 or 4 iterations that I had through my earlier career.
Yeah, and it's hindsight's 2020, right? If you draw a line between all the dots, which are the different points of your career, it makes so much sense that all of it culminated into this idea. So I want to talk about that for a minute. So you spent I think 8 years at Paragon,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so you obviously a lot of experience. You're sitting you're at the organization at a high level, and of course seeing cross border, making relationships, etc. What brought you to this idea that I need to start something, and sort of here's what this thing is going to be? Eventually, of course, it became Tracker. Was there a question that you had from a client? Was there an issue that you had, from working at Paragon, thinking, why doesn't this technology exist? Like, how did the idea actually come about? If there was a moment, maybe there was no moment.
Yeah. I think when we were in a situation where you were fighting with procurement teams in Europe over $100 on a container going from Rotterdam to Singapore. At that point, that became such a price-sensitive market that everything within Relo in Europe became commoditized, and you were looking at this constant battle. And a lot of the moving companies who were bidding direct were able to be much more competitive than an RMC would be, where an RMC was having to sit on top of those moving fees. So a lot of that business was making it more difficult to win. So I was trying to move the company towards a more data-driven approach to the business. And I remember I gave a presentation, I think it was way back in 2012, 2013 at HR event. I think it was it a HR? I think it was actually one of the early FEM events, the Forum for Expatriate Management event. It's not about the box, it's about the data. It's not about the move, it's not about the person. That the future of Relo was about managing the data associated with that particular move, so that you could now position yourself differently and say, well, we'll do all that moving, but what we're going to do is we're going to bring all the data to one place. So I at that point, I'd set up my own company called Relo Data, which was designed to be Relo and data and bring the two together. And then we had the confluence of events in that Paragon where they had some contract changes in the US, and they were downsizing in Europe. So I was surplus to requirements at that point, and I was approaching my 50s, and I said, well, I'm not going to go back working for somebody else again. This was the time to make the move. And you mentioned earlier on about joining those dots. And you're right that it's hindsight that you can see the dots. You don't know them while you're in the moment, but it's only when you actually realize, well, where did that come from? That you are the sum of your experience. And if you manage to bring a little piece of that experience along each time, then all of a sudden you end up in a more knowledgeable position. And as I said, approaching 50, I said, if I'm going to do it, it's going to be now. And I would have always viewed myself as primarily, as I said, as a salesperson. I'm thinking, who's going to hire a 50-year-old salesperson? They might hire a 50-year-old senior manager or whatever you might want to be. But this was the time to do it. So I set out and started with Relo Data, as I mentioned, and we've had a number of iterations. That's currently Tracker software now. And we got some support from the Enterprise Ireland agency here in Ireland, which is a government support agency for tech startups. So we got involved with their ecosystems. We got some grant aid. We got some supporting assistance from those guys. We got into incubator units in the universities. So we were in that whole tech startup ecosystem. And when I got in there, I was quite surprised at the amount of gray hair that was in there. That there was quite a lot of middle-aged entrepreneurs. I tend not to use the word entrepreneur that much. There are middle-aged people who are starting their own company. And it was quite encouraging to see that people were making this decision later on in their life. So it's not always about the 28-year-old with the fantastic idea who raises 100 million. Quite often it's the experienced, more mature person who has put together all those dots. And that started us off with building the product, which became GT Global Tracker at that time. And we were looking at distribution channels. We started working with Wykert. We started working with BDO in the EU. And again, to go back to the start, it always takes longer than you thought. We had an idea. We had an idea that this was something that we could bring together, a single technology that would support all of the compliance issues that a business traveler might encounter. So we weren't coming at it from a single vertical, because in my view, it's one traveler, it's one trip, but maybe 6 problems: tax, social security, immigration, posted worker, duty of care, medevac. It can be all within the same trip. So the view we had was that if I come at it with one approach, who's handling the other 5? So the user's experience was always going to have to be different. If I have to go one place for tax, another system for immigration, another system for duty of care, another system to book my travel. And that's where we started to say, well, this is time for us to bring together a unifying technology. And that's the horizontal technology that I talk about, as opposed to the vertical approaches by each of those managers, or each of those different groups. And it took longer and take-up was slower. But what was happening as well was we had a few things happening in the background. The US administration was becoming more protectionist. We're starting to see the effect of the economic crisis in that citizens were taxed to the hilt. So governments were now turning towards corporates to attract more taxation. So there was a lot more rocks being turned over by revenue authorities. Immigration authorities were becoming more strict. So we didn't invent business travel problems. They'd always been there, but quite often they were just simply not on the radar of regulatory authorities, not on the radar of senior managers in companies. They were quite happy. We've been going for years. It's never been a problem. But then suddenly people started to get stopped at borders a little bit more. They were asked a couple more questions about, well, what are you really doing here? And why do you have the power to hire or fire in this country? What type of work? When you say you're meeting colleagues, are you sitting in a room and working a whiteboard, or are you walking the factory floor and training people how to use machines? Right. All of those problems started to become more of an issue, because it's not so much where you were, it's what you were doing became the issue for tax and immigration authorities. And that's really where we wanted to bring the overall solution into one place.
I want to ask one question that backs up just a little bit. I first want to note that it's so refreshing to hear that you said, I was approaching my 50s and I realized I didn't want to start, work for somebody. I find I've spoken to a lot of individuals who feel that it's quote unquote too late for them. And I love your argument, because it makes so much sense. It's not too late. You've now finally reached the point where you've worked for X amount of years, you have this experience, and you've probably pinpointed a problem that you can actually solve, versus nothing against anybody who's younger. I mean, but if the younger you are, the less experience you have, and you're probably more likely to be looking for a problem that you want to solve just to start a company, versus actually knowing and living and experiencing a problem and then building a company around the solution. So I wanted to focus on that for a moment, because I know people who have ideas and they feel like it's too late. They feel like they can't risk it anymore. And I love that. Like, I think your story should be an inspiration to those folks. I want to ask you though a question. You mentioned that you got some funding and support from the government of Ireland, and this, like, for this, tech startup ecosystem. And I know you just shared sort of where the company went in terms of what you wanted to provide. What was your pitch to that incubator at the time? Like, what did you tell them that you were solving for them to say, great, this sounds good. Here's some resources and let's do it.
Um, I think the fact that everybody knew that these things happened in business. So when you're pitching to an incubator unit like that, the people on the other side are usually mentors, and they're usually experienced business people from all areas of business.
Mm-hmm.
And most of them will have been a business traveler at some point in time. So they were able to say that this is not just something that they couldn't understand or hadn't experienced. And what you found was that when you're explaining to them, these are problems you have to say, oh yeah, I did have a problem in Saudi 10 years ago. I had to go back and get a whole year's travel data, and it cost a lot of money to fix it. These things had happened to those people on the other side of the table. So first of all, they understood the problem, because a lot of them had experienced it, and there are war stories out there. So that helped in terms of being able to say, here is a problem, we've identified a problem, it does happen, we think it's going to get worse, or we think it's going to become more common, and that's why we're bringing this solution. So as you described, where I always would look at, well, what's the problem, and then build the solution for it. Whereas I think a lot of entrepreneurs who suddenly build a piece of tech, they have a solution that's looking for a problem. And what we really want to make sure is that you start with the problem, because if you don't start with the problem, then your solution is never going to work. So you might have something that is conceptually okay, but if the people that you're trying to pitch it to have never experienced it, don't recognize it, then I'm not saying that it won't ever come to pass, but what I'm saying is that gives you more success and credibility with those units that were signing off on grant aid or funding for that, because they were saying, yeah, I've seen this problem, it's live, if that solution works, it's something we should back. And I think that was probably the main part of that. And it was Dragon's Den or Shark Tank, I think you call it over there, type of scenarios. You went in and you had to pitch your idea. What gave a lot of credibility, though, as well, was our early sales channels. We had come with a technology. It wasn't a concept. We had a working product, and we had a distribution channel. So you were able to articulate, here's a problem. They recognized the problem, and then we were able to say, and at the time it was BDO and Weichert were our first channels to market, and those were recognizable names. So when the team looked at that, they said, well, okay, we're starting to put product, position, and channels together here. So it looked like a real business, as opposed to it being a minimum viable product in a piece of tech that hadn't got legs and hadn't been tested in the marketplace.
And how did you, and that was going to be my sort of second question there, how did you what did you leverage to build relationships with BDO and Weichert? Was it your prior relationships, or? Yeah.
It was purely and simply the experience and contacts from the relocation world, in terms of finding the right person in that organization, and pitching to them. And those early people, Andrew Bailey, Stuart McCardle, and Susan Myers and Alter, they were the ones who saw the potential at the very early stage, because they were living the same problem. They were the ones who wanted to get that out of their existing tech set, or wanted us as a plugin, or were looking for a plugin to help resolve this particular problem. So by recognizing that and then pitching in, and what we also did was we made it affordable. We didn't come in with a very expensive entry-level model with monthly fees, because we knew it was going to become a long sale. So we had, obviously there was revenue to build it and get it running, but we then said, well, the next time you'll pay us is when you have a customer. So we didn't get revenue until they got revenue. So there was no monthly meeting or quarterly meeting where the CFO was saying, why are we paying this and we haven't sold any yet? We were able to pace their costs and their revenue at the same time. And that's where the getting the funding and the backing initially supported that, and we had some initial funding. I bootstrapped some myself, and we had Diana Busk of going there. The DSP was an early investor, and that's where we got the initial funding to be able to get that distribution channel up and grab that market effectively.
That's awesome. Kudos to you for doing that, because I feel like a lot of folks are worried about reaching out to their network and saying, "Hey, here's a business idea. Can I run it by you?" So there's just so much to learn from this. I want to take a small pause and just throw out to folks to leave some comments, drop some questions here in the chat. If you're here watching live, let us know who you are, where you are, etc. Let's get a conversation going with you there out. Liam, I want to at this point turn to what Tracker does, right? So like, what does the company do today? And I just, for myself, for the listeners to understand, what are your goals? What problems are you solving, rather? Let's start there, and then eventually I want to hear about sort of like what's next for the company.
Sure. So I would describe us as a horizontal player in terms of managing the multiple risks of business travel compliance. And as I mentioned, it's not just immigration, it's not just tax, it's not just social security. It can be all of those, one of those, or two of those, or three, or any combination of those 3 or 4 areas, and duty of care in terms of safety as well. And what we recognized was that if we were to put this into organizations, that they would continually look at the user's experience and say, well, what's the user's experience going to be in terms of interacting with all of those verticals? So for companies that are selling immigration services directly or selling tax services directly, the traveler in the past would have been directed towards the Deloitte, the Big Four, the EY system. They would have been sent towards the immigration company system, and would those two islands wouldn't connect. Quite often, the internal stakeholder wasn't creating a link to the HRIS systems. So the traveler was having to enter profile information in both systems. They weren't talking to each other. So there was a lot of that type of additional work when you're working in that vertical market. So what we saw was that there's the ability to come in a layer above that and create this horizontal technology that gave the traveler a single experience. So when we work with a company now, we will come in, we will be a single sign-on from their identity management system, and InfoSec is a very, very strong part of what we do, and security is very important. And then we take the link from the HRIS system, the Workday, the Oracle, SAP. We've connected to all of those systems with our customer base. So now the profile is fed from HRIS. So we're now equipped for that internal stakeholder, either the traveler or the tax person, the immigration person, HR person in that company, to be able to feed cases downstream to the vertical providers. So we connect out to immigration companies, we connect to the tax companies. So we don't take any of those transactions, we don't provide any of those services. We're simply the enabling layer of technology that allows the company to holistically view everything associated with that traveler and the multiple areas. Because if a traveler has a tax issue today and an immigration issue tomorrow or next week on a different trip, in the vertical market, they're looking at two systems. They can't link them together. What we're doing is putting all of those from. So when you look at a traveler, you're able to say, okay, there's a tax case open, there's an immigration case open, there's a posted worker case open. We're looking at the day count, number of days that they're spending in each location. I can drill into the system, see all of the active visas. I can see all of the documents. So for instance, in your world, Roman, where we would upload a lot of I-9 verification documentation, things like that, where inbound assignees need to have it uploaded. We're alerting people to what's happening. And we built our own internal rules engine to alert those subject matters internally when travel is starting to accumulate. And it's across all of the verticals. It's not just, here's your tax problem. It's all of the different verticals, because there's different thresholds that a tax issue will occur, different thresholds that an immigration issue will occur. And what that means is that the traveler has one place. There's one source of truth for everything associated with their activity. For the corporate, they're not having to maintain 4 or 5 separate HRIS connections. And with InfoSec, it's a much more difficult equation now. So if they're managing one connection to SAP and Workday, then the security elements are managed, and then we manage the security connections down via API to each of those sub vendors underneath. So commercially, yes, we charge a fee for that, and it's a subscription basis for the traveler. But all of the transactions still flow through to the vertical groups underneath, and that's where we connect to everyone. We don't have any preferred set of providers. We'll go into an organization, and quite often we'll be competing, for instance, against a big 4 company who's looking to provide their business traveler technology. And if we're successful, we may be connecting back to that big 4 because they're the tax provider or they're an immigration provider for that particular company. So we don't set out our set of, like, we don't always bring our existing network in. It's about making sure that we can just slot in for the company and then connect to all of their relevant sub vendors and make the system as easy as possible for them.
Do you ever get, this is a really big pain point I've found in the industry, at least within the immigration vertical. I'm sure you wouldn't be surprised to hear that even within immigration, there are sub verticals where different systems align with one another. I mean, Laborless is one of them. We provide a specific solution. What I have found, at least in the immigration technology side, is that you can't just go out and connect to other similar companies within the vertical via API because they don't have them, or at least they're not public. And if you want to, integrate, you have to go through the trouble of requesting API and, building that out. Did you see challenges with that? Or is it one of those things where if a company takes you on, since they are the client, they're your client, and they're also the vertical service provider's client, they dictate and say, guys, we want you all to connect, figure it out?
Yeah. And that you have hit on a very apt problem, because we have the advantage of being a very new technology. We're only 5 years old as a technology. So we were built on modern API friendly, GDPR compliant technology. So we don't have a long legacy system that we had to make and change as API technology developed. So we built it with that in mind. Whereas older companies with those legacy systems do have that issue. And you'll be quite surprised, some of the biggest companies in the world who don't support API connectivity. They'll move to SFTP, which is a layer down, but you'll be very surprised about that. And that's where we work to help those clients as much as possible. So we're quite happy to take whatever layer of connectivity that the client can manage. But moving towards a REST API or a JSON type of communication is really where we think the sub-vendor chain should be moving now, because you won't always own the vertical work. There will always be vertical connections. But what we're seeing at the very largest companies, Fortune 100 companies, they don't want to make 8 connections. They can't manage them, they can't maintain them, and it's not a secure process. So they want to make one connection, and then from there, the vendor has the responsibility of managing the connections out to the sub-vendor group. And that's really where we are now. We're involved in about 16 different implementations at the moment. And it's quite surprising, some of the biggest companies that you would expect to be API friendly, but they're not, as you know.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm not surprised, but I'm sure some people might be surprised. One other question that this brings up in my mind, and I'm just sort of brainstorming kind of, I'm always looking for, well, what about this and what about that kind of a challenge. A lot of these vertical specific solutions spend a lot of time and money investing in their UI, right? And making it incredibly user friendly. And it sounds to me like the major benefit that Tracker provides is that the ultimate end user, so the corporate, et cetera, they have one source of truth. They have one location that they go to see data that comes in, is fed in through multiple vertically integrated software solutions. Do you ever, I just would imagine one of those companies thinking, what the hell? We spent all this time building this beautiful interface, and then our clients don't even see it. They see it via another company's interface. Is that ever something that a conversation you have or something you've run into, or does that not really matter at the end of the day?
It absolutely does. And again, the issue there is there will always be a market for those direct vertical clients. There will always be clients that are not organized in the multi-stakeholder view, and they will simply continue to purchase those direct connections. So it's that market's not going away. But what we're seeing is in a certain segment, this is the change that's coming up, is that those previously vertical providers are becoming API connections to this integration layer that sits across. And there is there's a certain pride associated with that, in terms of, well, we've got a nice piece of kit. But if the company has already made the decision that they're going to come into a single unified place, then that decision is made. So the only alternative then is to take the transactions from that channel. And because we don't intermediate, or we don't have any referral fees, or don't have any commercial element to that, it makes it a little bit easier, because it's about, well, we're going to get the transactions anyhow. So the revenue for the corporation should remain the same, albeit it's coming in through a separate channel. And if I was in those companies' view, that would be primarily what I would think is, well, is this going to affect my revenue? I think there's a fear in the relocation world that when, for instance, an RMC comes in a relationship, that there's going to be a little shave off of fees somewhere along the way. We don't do things like that. So that's where I think the slight difference could be. Yes, there are suppliers out there that really want to continue working direct with their client, but when the client directs you to work with the middleware, as we would be, then it just really comes down to which client do you want to be? You know?
Yeah, no,
those decisions will happen a lot more in the years to come, I think.
And that's a great point. I mean, at the end of the day, yes, while they might think about the fact that they're not directly, quote unquote, interfacing with the client, they're getting the same amount of money at the end of the day, which, it's a business, and that's kind of what they, I suppose, care about. So yeah, that's a really interesting point, or a really good point. I was just sort of interested because that was the instinct or the instinctual question that came to mind.
So I think a good way to Rome, just to understand that, is that over the last year, and COVID has been a catalyst for companies they've accelerated their decision making in terms of pre-trip assessment and understanding, well, in March 2020, we were all caught out. We didn't know where anybody was. And now we need to know where they're going, if only from a COVID point of view, and negligence, and understanding that I'm going to send somebody into possibly a COVID hotspot. So we're seeing this move towards pre-trip assessment. But it's in all those areas of tax, immigration, posted work. The mobility group has latched onto the travel team, and these two groups are finally talking to each other to create this multi-stakeholder approach to the business. And that's where they are at. And if we look at the RFPs that we've been involved in over the last year, we're not seeing those vertical providers being called into those RFPs, because they're only providing a vertical approach, whereas the RFP is about, well, we're going out for tax, social security, immigration, posted worker, duty of care, COVID supports, all in one area. So unless those verticals pivot into those areas or partner, then they're not going to be called to RFP. And that's where the big four are probably the main areas of that. It's the bigger companies who traditionally be big four type companies. And I think the recent PwC deal will make a very strong competitor. That new co will really be very strong in this area, because they will now be going out without any of the constraints of the big four, and putting that technology and working the sub-vendor chain underneath.
So with the COVID realities of COVID being, still prevalent today and continuing to kind of shift the way we travel, I wanted to just quickly touch on, I know that, well, there was some news from just a few months ago that you guys raised $2 million of, I guess was it venture capital money, or was it private equity? I don't know if I.
Yeah, but we've raised over 4 million to date
in total,
in terms of total funding. In 2018, ECA International out of London took a minority stake in the organization and invested a seven-figure sums at that point. And then during this summer, we then had a complete restructure and raised another 2 million at that point. Some of our early investors cashed out at that point in time. So now we continue. It's just myself and ECA are the owners of the company at this point in time. So it's not venture capital, it's a trade partner. ECA International they don't compete with any of our channels in terms of they're not an RMC. So because we work with multiple RMCs, we couldn't or wouldn't take investments from an RMC because then that would affect our relationship with the others. But ECA are very well positioned in terms of being a data software provider. So they were an excellent investor for us in the company. So having that funding has allowed us now, we're going to triple our workforce in the next 18 months. We've added 10 people in the last 6 months alone, and we'll get up to tripling that workforce. And that's what that funding is used for. The product is evolving all of the time, but it's a hairy time, and raising funds, as I'm sure you know yourself, is not an easy piece. And anyone who tells you that they really enjoyed doing that is, to my opinion, they're stretching the truth a little bit. It can be very stressful because you've got a situation where you're hiring people, you want to hold and hire good people, so you got to make sure you've got that amount of investment that's going to allow you to get to where you need to be as an organization.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I was going to ask is because you just don't. There isn't a lot of fundraising that happens within the industry, but with COVID-19 really taking things and turning them upside down, to your point with this kind of hyper awareness of compliance in terms of travel from a health perspective, from immigration rules are changing daily. And so are they able, can they go and come back if they do go on an international assignment, things like that. So I think hopefully investment will increase. And look, we bootstrap laborless. We don't have any outside funders actually. But I've obviously talked to a lot of investors, whether on my own behalf or in general, and I understand the space, and there are pluses and minuses to it. And I'm not saying that it's, I'm not of the camp that necessarily raising money means you're successful. That's not, of course, always the case. But I do think that if there's money that's willing to be put into an industry, it should, I think, incentivize more people to try to build new things because they know that they can get the support of an investor, right? And so it'll lead to more failures, but at least it's going to lead to iteration of ideas. And so that's why I'm excited to hear, that you guys were able to raise funds, and some other companies, more recently in the immigration and mobility space, have been able to get investment. I hope that it helps push that person that's working a full-time job, and has an idea, but just doesn't feel that they can go off and quit and support their family and do it on their own. I want that person to go out and try and get funding and use, someone else's expertise to build the next whatever company within our industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And they are happening. There's a lot of different companies, certainly in terms of payments. We're seeing that. We're in terms of global payroll, the ability to provide those software systems where traditionally you had a multi-domestic environment. And that, I think, is the next wave in terms of where you'll see significant investment in those particular areas as well.
I hope so. So I want to kind of, as we're wrapping up, I'm curious to know, and you sort of mentioned you're tripling your workforce, you're continuing to iterate on the product and of course this, recent add-on funding has been helpful. What's your vision for, Tracker software in the future? Do you want to see more integration with more clients? Do you want to see additional sort of verticals that you can now put under your umbrella? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, my objective is to make the platform the standard platform for business traveler management, so that we would look to be as strong as possible in that area. And that's why, for instance, on the big four environment where you saw the PwC move away, they had so many conflicts that nobody went in and owned that particular area. So this is an wide open space. And when we're powering, I think, 14 of the current industry business traveler tools, which means that we've got 14 of our partners who are pitching for business out there. So we want to make sure that when companies look at those 14 partners of ours, they see that it's our platform underneath, and that's taken as a given. And then the relationship management and the pricing that our partner would offer becomes the commercial rationale. And that's where we really want to be. So from a vision point of view, if I was arrogant, yes, we want to be the dominant software platform for business traveler management. And in terms of vertical connections, we're absolutely agnostic to any vendor. So if the client says, will you connect? Can you connect? Our answer is always yes. As you said earlier on, the vendor may not always be able to do that, but there's ways around that as well in terms of importing and CSV elements until they get up to speed with elements of API connectivity. But we really want to work with those companies and make sure that we're now going to become a new area for mobility people to look into the life of a traveler. Because at the moment, when they look into Workday, they only see bits of their person. When they look into ADP payroll, they see other bits. Then they're having to go to other vertical systems. By bringing all of that together into one area, then we're in a position to support those mobility teams and make sure that they're able to do that. And we're funded and financially stable for the long term. And it does take longer, as I said right at the start. It takes longer than you think. And some of our competitors are well established, some are new as well, and some are really determining where they go with what they want to do. So we're quite encouraged by what we see. We think this is a very large addressable market. When you're in Relo, you're only looking at the people who are moving. There's companies that are moving 1,000 people a day for business travel that you wouldn't even consider in a Relo world. So we open up a whole new addressable market for our partners to be able to say, nobody moved during 2020 or during COVID, but we were able to build relationships with clients because business travel, people looked at their business travel processes, put together new processes, and now we're bringing our RMC partners into those companies that they didn't previously have a relationship with, or if they did have a relationship with it, they're now talking to a separate user group in the organization. So they're able to go sideways in the organization rather than have to rely on a known pie of Relo moves, whereas generally your business traveler is going to be maybe 8 to 10 times the constituency of the relocation pie.
So can companies that integrate with Tracker benefit from the fact that you sit above, in a sense, and have access to additional client? I mean, because I know you said you don't have referral fees, you don't have official, let's say, partners where you refer. You're sort of neutral, but nevertheless, from the other perspective, if someone wants to approach you and to say, hey, we'd love to be part of your network, whatever that might mean, is there a benefit to let's say RMCs that are maybe trying to grow or something like that? Is there a benefit for them to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Because if we go into a corporate, and these are Fortune 100 companies, so they will almost always have an existing supplier base. Mm-hmm. So that's the first port of call is the existing supplier base. If those suppliers resist or aren't able to come to this new integration point, then clients will have asked us and I said, well, do you know other people who are in those positions? So we have been able to introduce other partners into companies, but again, we don't take any. It's a warm handoff, and we would say to clients. So that's where companies want. The advantage for the corporate is I want to streamline this process here. If I give you an example of producing a letter of invite, we take data from the profile, HR profile of the system, the immigration requirements to produce a letter of invite, and we can reduce down to about 8 to 10 seconds producing a letter of invite for a business traveler entering on a business visa for use at a border or submission to for a business visa. Whereas in the past, that was somebody get a template, 5 or 6 emails back and forth. What are you doing? Where are you going? And it took a lot of time to do that. With systems like ours, we're helping those really stressed mobility and immigration teams to simply produce the information quickly, publish it to the portal where the traveler can get going on their travel. And that's where they're going to see the real advantage. So the companies underneath who want to connect with us, we think we can give this mutual advantage. And it's your business, the transaction and the completion of the tax return and the completion of the immigration activity. You'll still continue to make that revenue and still have a relationship with the client. We don't own the client in that respect. It's still, we're not usurping any contract. Nobody comes through us to contract. we become a technical vendor. The relationship stays with the vertical provider and the corporate directly.
Yeah, that's pretty brilliant, actually. Cool. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. I'm curious, especially as a lot of the folks who listen in and just are generally in my network are within the sort of RMC, DSP, et cetera, tax, of course, in obviously immigration world. So, um, I just want to pull in one comment here from Marianne saying touche for something I said earlier, but it's the art of the start, as Guy Kawasaki says. Guy Kawasaki, a very inspirational sort of investor entrepreneur. So thanks, Marianne. And Marianne also has been in the immigration space for a number of years. So Marianne, definitely, if you guys aren't connected yet, follow Liam, get in touch. So super exciting. I want to end with one question, a fun one, hopefully. I feel like so I wasn't born in New York. I was born in Ukraine, but I came to New York when I was 2. So for all intents and purposes, I was born and bred. I've basically lived in New York my whole life. I am very opinionated about food in New York, and I take you as kind of like a born and bred Dubliner. Like I feel like you're the guy who just is from there and now you live there and you grew up, 10 minutes away. I'm curious, and this is maybe selfish because next time I come back to Dublin, what's your favorite place to eat in the place where you grew up and spent your childhood and now you're spending your adulthood? Where is your go-to place if someone's there for 24 hours?
Ooh. You see, I'm sort of older now, and I'm out in the suburbs, so it'll probably be a suburban place. But I think my sort of formative years, this place is not there anymore. It's changed names, but it's the same. If you're talking about a place that's in town and it's close to everything, a place called Mary's Bar on Wicklow Street. It used to be called Casper and Giambini. So it was sort of my first you're talking about New York, your first introduction to American style food, and it just became a real cool place to eat and party in Dublin when I was growing up. So the building is still there. The name has changed and the iteration is to change, but it's right across from Brown Thomas, the sort of premier store. Grafton Street's the pedestrianized upscale shopping district. So that would be where I would have it. You walk in and it represents an old Irish shop, and then you go down into the deep. But it's not what it used to be, but it's still there.
That's super cool. I'm curious. So is it American food that's served there or American style food?
Well, you see, there's no real Irish food if you think about it. We're not a known cuisine on a global basis. Nobody says let's do Irish tonight. And if they do that, they're probably referring to Guinness or alcohol more so than any food. If there is a traditional Dublin dish called coddle, and it's basically sausages, rasher, bacon, potatoes, all boiled up. It harks back to our poverty years, and it was the working class dish. But that's probably the most Dublin dish you'll get. So if you are in Dublin and you want to find somebody that will do coddle, CODDLE, that's something you should experience.
Wow, that's cool. And I hadn't known that. I honestly, the last time I went, and this is going to sound very touristy, but I went to Leo Burdocks twice. There's one in Temple Bar, which is a little bit touristy. I didn't really love. And there's, I think, the original one. I forget where it is. It's by a large church.
Yeah, it's up on Werburgh Street, opposite Christchurch Cathedral, and that is what would be called a chipper, and it's basically a takeaway with what you call fries. We call them chips.
Chips, yep.
But they're not French fries. These would be thick chipper chips, as they're referred to here in Ireland, and you get a deep fried battered fish there, but it's very similar to the UK. But that particular store runs the fryers on coal, and that adds to the element of the flavor there. So that's why every night you'll drive by there's a queue. I'm sure you queued for it. You didn't just turn up for that. That's every single day there's a queue, probably 20, 30 people every single night.
Well, I'm clearly due for a trip, and I'm very hungry, obviously. So this is a really nice way to end. So Liam, thank you. This has been super interesting, and this has been a unique conversation because I'm realizing through our, discussion that most of the people I talk to live within one of, multiple verticals, and so it's really cool to hear this sort of concept of technology layer on top of a neutral technology layer sitting on top of the many different verticals that make up mobility. So I appreciate it. Thank you for your time, and
Sure.
congrats on the recent fundraising. I'm excited to to follow you guys and continue to watch Tracker's growth in the future.
Perfect. Thanks for having me, Roman. Very good. Very nice talking to you. And if you are coming to Dublin, look me up and I'll take you on a personal tour.
That's definitely going to happen. Awesome.
No problem.
Thank you, Liam. Thank you guys so much. This was what an interesting conversation. I'm kind of glad. I'm really glad that Liam was open to and willing to talk about this idea of like, well, what happens when companies push back, right, within the different verticals? Because I think that's an important question. I think all of us have pushback against what we're trying to offer, by whether it's by other folks in the industry or potential clients, and sort of how do you deal with that? How do you go around that? I think sometimes, well, oftentimes, learning from everyone else's challenges and mistakes can teach us something more than just learning from their wins and successes. So what a really interesting conversation. Thank you all for being here, for watching, for tuning in. I took 2 weeks off, so it was really cool to get back into the swing of things. We'll be back next week with another awesome conversation. In the meantime, everybody, peace out, stay safe. COVID's still a thing, so please stay safe out there, and thanks as always.